Mayor Pro Tem?
The more we talk, the more confusing this gets. I mean, might as well go to Vegas. We keep talking about the Redondo wells, and you have said that the price of oil was $10 a barrel. Of course, the technology wasn't there like it is today. But I would think that from what I've seen where those wells terminated, back then they called it, I guess, slant drilling instead of directional. They were pretty close to the border for most of some of those. I think there were 35 out there, and I think they were pretty close to where we started.
Correct.
And I keep hearing that the different sand layers produce different amount of oil per se. So, and then you say that there's probably more oil in off of Hermosa, but how can you, I know again it's a guesstimate, but I can't imagine that these sand out there layers are going to be that much different in that area. I'm not.
No, the sandlet, what went into the geological picture is just a continuation of the Redondo Beach. It did not really increase or decrease what the original oil in place number is. I think if you want to argue a point, it would be the next slide, is how much ultimately what's the recovery of that oil in place? Because then that gets into, well, that's kind of like, that's the next section we can talk about.
As you say, the oil recovery could be as high as 21% of initial place compared to 8.6 that was obtained from Redondo. So I'm assuming that the technology is better. Is that why we get a higher return? Or
Do I want the next one?
Is that a recovery question?
That's kind of like the next
Okay, we can do
slide.
that
If you
second.
want to,
Okay.
we need to
No,
go
it's
to that
all-
now, or?
Let's hang tight
No,
for a
that's
second.
fine. So I'll leave it at that. Maybe more around the recovery side, but that's, okay. We can move on.
I got two questions, Curtis. Sure. On page 25, the middle paragraph, you talk about base recovery. I think I understand how you compare the base recovery number of 8.6 to the high case of 17.2 and then come up with our or Hermosa's, this report's version of low, expected, and high. But as I read it, it sounds, well, maybe instead of me judging it, will you articulate how you come up with the three numbers that get to low, medium, and high? Actually,
The 8.6, let's just go on to this one. So.
Oh, this is recovery too?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me ask my question, my last question, and I'm pretty certain this is volume. You said, I think, in answer to one of the questions about the deposition-related data, sorry, you answered a question about the deposition. My question about the deposition report, I'm not, maybe you haven't been able to look at it, but is it likely that the data that drove the deposition analysis is the same data that you've worked from, or is it could it be a whole new set of data? We don't know
It's
yet?
going to be the same information. As far
Sort
as
of
I know, it'll be the same information
like the same
for
core
CBA.
information.
Right.
Okay.
It'll still be the same source information.
Okay. Okay, then I'll hold off on my volume question too, and then why don't you start with slide B, and we'll keep going.
Okay. This is kind of where we're at. So recovery rate is the theoretical amount of oil that can be recovered from the original oil in place number. So it shouldn't be constrained by any factors, but the actual amount of produced oil is going to be contingent upon geology, drilling practices, how much capital investment goes into the field. In other words, if you have a field out there with X number of barrels in it, you can say that it's going to recover 50% of the oil, but if oil price is at $5 a barrel, that oil will stay in the ground. So the actual producible will be zero, but the recovery factor remains the same. So it's theoretical how much oil you can get out of the ground. There is a limit to it. And the question is, why can't you get 100% of oil out of the ground? It just doesn't want to come out of the ground. It becomes a issue where the oil wants to hold on to the sand grains and not let go. It just does not. You'll leave in even a large field like Wilmington, you'll still leave 70% of the oil in the ground. So the recovery rates in CBA are based on estimated probability range. Admit the 8.6 is from in part from the Intero report. The 12.5 or 12.9 is a similar number that we would use in Wilmington for not necessarily a water flood, but if how much water you put into the ground for Wilmington does affect how much oil you get out. Since what is projected in this field for Hermosa Beach is that won't be a true water flood, but water will be going back into the ground for two reasons. One, to maintain pressure, ensure no subsidence, and two is to dispose of the water. In that context is that does lend itself to similar curves that I've used in Wilmington, where it's about 12.5% recovery expected for those sort of situations. So the 17.5 or 17.2 is a high estimate of and I think it was lower than what the Intero reports were saying, but it was a high estimate of what could come out of the ground here, what the projected recovery rate is.
You guys are done on?
That's it.
Done on this? Okay. Any questions on item B? Councilman Fingeri, start. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Is the recovery related to the pressure under which the oil is contained?
The easy answer is yes. And so there's a lot of different ways to produce an oil field. If I went to Huntington Beach, to the onshore area, not the offshore, you have wells with no pressure, yet they still produce 2, 3, 4, 5 barrels a day. It's a little bit different in that you want to maintain pressure probably here in Redondo and Hermosa Beach. Partially it helps to keep the production going, and you do have a limited time frame and when possibly that you can recover the oil. So it is beneficial for maintaining a higher production rate, yes.
Okay, and I think you mentioned earlier that you were not sure, didn't have enough data about the amount of pressure that the oil in Hermosa would be. How does that put into question the estimates that you provided?
A lot of the Redondo Beach wells had sufficient pressure to get some fluid to surface, nothing dramatic, just enough to produce a few barrels before they pressure depleted and they had to be put on some sort of lift mechanism to get the oil to surface. Did that play into any of the estimates? No. I would have to assume that because the amount of water that's going to be injected back in the ground, it would maintain some sort of pressure component.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.